"Uncle, the woman in the picture is my mother," said the boy to the millionaire who was crying in the cemetery. Richard Sullivan wiped his tears with the back of his hand as he gazed at the memorial covered in expensive flowers. The marble, tombstone specially ordered from Italy, seemed too small to hold all the memories he had of Emily. That's when he felt a light touch on his shoulder. Turning around, he faced a boy who couldn't have been more than 8 years old. Short curly hair, light tan skin, and big expressive eyes that stared at him with a mix of curiosity and determination. "Uncle, the woman in the picture is my mom," the boy said, pointing to the framed portrait of Emily Parker that adorned the memorial. Richard looked at the boy with suspicion. At nearly 50 years old, he'd seen it all. As the owner of one of the country's largest construction companies, he was used to people trying to take advantage of his wealth. "Who are you? How did you get in here?" he asked, standing up and straightening his impeccable dark suit. "My name is Ethan, and this cemetery is open to everyone," the boy replied, holding his gaze. There was no fear in his voice, just unshakable certainty. "I come here every month with Mrs. Wilson." Richard studied the boy more closely. There was something in his eyes, in the way he held his chin up. It reminded him of Emily. But maybe it was just his mind playing tricks, fueled by the grief that hadn't faded even after 3 years since her passing. "Listen, kid. I don't know what you want, but—" Richard was cut off when the boy pulled a colorful beaded bracelet from his pocket. "My mom made this for me before she got sick," Ethan explained, holding out the worn bracelet. "She had one just like it. She's wearing it in the picture." Richard's eyes instinctively darted back to the portrait. The colorful beaded bracelet adorned Emily's delicate wrist in the photograph, a detail he'd never noticed before, despite his countless visits to the grave. A chill ran down his spine. That detail wasn't something just anyone would know. The bracelet had been made during a trip to Florida 7 years ago. He'd been there himself when the local artisan taught Emily the special braiding technique. "Who sent you here?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. "No one," Ethan replied. "Mrs. Wilson brings me every month. She took care of me after Mom left, but today—" The boy hesitated for the first time. "Today I saw you crying and I thought I needed to talk to you." Richard suddenly felt exposed, vulnerable. He looked around and saw an elderly woman with white hair sitting on a bench in the distance, watching their interaction closely. "Is that Mrs. Wilson?" he asked, pointing. Ethan nodded. "Let's go talk to her," Richard decided, trying to maintain his composure. As they walked down the stone path of Greenwood Cemetery, in the heart of New York City, Richard kept glancing at the boy from the corner of his eye. His walk, the way he swung his arms, small details that seemed to echo Emily in a way that couldn't be faked. Mrs. Wilson stood up as they approached. She was a petite woman, her dark skin marked by time with a natural dignity that transcended her simple clothes. "You must be Richard," she said before he could introduce himself. "Emily talked about you a lot." The words hit Richard like a punch. Emily had talked about him, to this woman he'd never met, to this boy who was now looking at him expectantly. "I don't understand," he finally said. "Emily and I ended our relationship over 7 years ago. She never reached out after that. Never mentioned." His words caught in his throat as his eyes returned to the boy. "She tried," Mrs. Wilson said firmly, "many times, but your secretary and your sister always blocked her. After she fell ill, Emily thought it best to wait for the right moment. She didn't want you two to reunite, out of pity or obligation." Ethan watched the conversation in silence, clutching the colorful bracelet tightly. "This is absurd," murmured Richard, more to himself than to the others. "My sister would never hide something like this from me." Mrs. Wilson gave a sad smile. "Do you truly know your family so well, Mr. Sullivan?" she asked softly. Richard looked at the boy again. Ethan must have been around 7 years old. If he really was Emily's son, the timing matched the end of their relationship. A relationship his family had never supported, considering Emily unsuitable for someone of his social standing. Richard took a deep breath, trying to gather his thoughts. "I need to confirm all of this." "Of course," Mrs. Wilson agreed. Emily left all the necessary documents, birth certificate, medical records, photos, everything saved for when this day came. Richard felt as if the ground were giving way beneath him. For years he had buried himself in work to forget Emily, convincing himself the breakup had been the best decision for both of them. And now, faced with this boy who might be his son, all his certainties crumbled. "Can I see those documents?" he asked, struggling to keep his voice steady. "You may," Mrs. Wilson replied. "They're all in our apartment." "Do you live far from here?" Richard asked, glancing at his watch. "In Greenwich Village," the older woman explained. "It's not as luxurious as what you're used to, but it's our home." Ethan, who had stayed quiet during the adults' conversation, finally spoke up. "Do you really want to know who I am?" he asked, staring at Richard. The question, so direct and mature for such a young child, caught Richard off guard. There was something in the way the boy spoke, a mix of vulnerability and strength that felt impossibly familiar. "Yes," Richard answered, surprised by the certainty in his own voice. "I want to know everything." The drive to Greenwich Village was filled with the tense silence that filled the interior of Richard's Range Rover Sport. Ethan gazed out the window, fascinated by the luxurious car, but holding back his excitement. Mrs. Wilson sat upright in the passenger seat, her hands tightly gripping the worn purse she carried. Richard drove automatically through the streets of New York City, his mind a whirlwind of unanswered questions. If Ethan really was his son, how would his family react? How would Ashley, his current fiancée, handle this revelation? And how would he himself, a man who had always meticulously planned every detail of his life, adjust to this new reality? When they arrived at the old building on Bedford Street, Richard felt transported to a world entirely different from his own. The building, which had seen better days, retained a faded charm with its wrought iron balconies and Art Deco details. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now back to the story. Mrs. Wilson's apartment was on the 3rd floor, with no elevator. Richard followed the boy and the older woman up the worn staircase. The hallway, though simple, was impeccably clean, with potted plants decorating each landing. When Mrs. Wilson opened the door to apartment 302, Richard was greeted by a modest yet cozy space. The small living room was furnished with well-preserved, antique pieces and framed photos that immediately caught his eye. In nearly every one, Emily was smiling. Emily holding baby Ethan in her arms. Emily teaching the boy to walk. Emily and Ethan blowing out birthday candles, an entire life that had unfolded without him knowing. "Please, have a seat," invited Mrs. Wilson, gesturing toward the sofa covered with a colorful crocheted throw. "I'll fetch the documents and make some coffee." As she walked toward the kitchen, Richard remained still, absorbing every detail of the surroundings so different from his own. The living room walls displayed framed children's drawings, undoubtedly Ethan's creations. One in particular stood out, a sketch of 3 figures, a woman, a boy, and a man in a suit, all holding hands. "I drew that when I was 5, Ethan explained, noticing Richard's interest. "Mom used to show me pictures of you and tell me stories about you." Richard felt a lump in his throat. "What kind of stories?" he managed to ask. Ethan shrugged, casually sitting on the worn armchair. "About how you met in college, how smart you were and how hard you worked. She said you built skyscrapers so tall they almost touched the clouds." An involuntary smile crossed Richard's face. That was exactly the kind of thing Emily would say, always exaggerating his achievements with that infectious enthusiasm of hers. "Your mother was always too generous in her descriptions," he remarked, finally sitting on the sofa. "She also said you were stubborn," Ethan added with disarming honesty, "and that your family didn't like her because she was, how did she put it? Oh, not from the right background." Richard's face grew warm. It was true. His family, especially his sister Victoria, had never accepted Emily. The daughter of a housekeeper wasn't what the Sullivans envisioned for the heir to the construction company. Mrs. Wilson returned with a cardboard box and a tray of coffee and cookies. "Here's everything Emily kept for this moment," she said, handing the box to Richard. "She knew you two would meet one day." With slightly trembling hands, Richard opened the box. On top lay a letter with his name written in Emily's unmistakable handwriting. Beneath it were neatly organized folders containing documents, photos, and newspaper clippings. As he unfolded the letter, it was as if he could hear her voice again. Dear Richard, if you're reading this, it means you finally met our son, Ethan. I know you must be confused, maybe even angry that I never told you in person. Believe me, I tried so many times. When I found out I was pregnant, you had already given in to your family's pressure and ended our relationship. I went to your office several times, but your secretary, following your sister's orders, never let me see you. I left letters, all returned unopened. I don't want you to feel guilty. I chose to raise our son alone, and I've never regretted it. Ethan has been the greatest joy of my life. If I'm leaving sooner than I'd like, my only comfort is knowing Ethan will be in good hands. Mrs. Wilson has been like a mother to us both, but she's getting older too. Ethan needs his father now. I'm not asking you to accept him out of obligation. Just get to know him. He has so much of you. The determination, the intelligence, even that little frown between your eyebrows when you're focused. I've always loved you, Richard. And believe it or not, I never spoke ill of you to our son. He grew up knowing his father was a good man, just kept from us by circumstances beyond our control. With eternal love, Emily. Richard lifted his eyes from the letter, feeling the weight of years of unintended absence. Ethan watched him curiously, nibbling on a cookie. You're crying, the boy observed, without judgment. Richard hadn't even noticed the tears streaming down his face. He quickly wiped them away. Your mother, she was a special person, he managed to say. I know, Ethan replied simply. She was the best person in the world. Mrs. Wilson watched the scene with a mix of apprehension and hope. There's more in the box, she said softly. The birth certificate is there, with your name as the father. Emily insisted on it, even knowing you were unaware. Richard continued exploring the contents of the box. He found the birth certificate, DNA tests done right after Ethan's birth. Emily had always been cautious, and dozens of photos documenting the boy's growth. In one of them, Ethan was wearing a New York Yankees jersey, the team Richard had rooted for since childhood. Mom said you like the Yankees, Ethan remarked, pointing at the photo. I cheer for them too, even when they lose. Richard felt something break inside him. A barrier he hadn't even known existed melted away before the innocence of this boy who, unknowingly, repeated exactly what he always said about his team. True fans stay loyal even in defeat. Ethan, Richard began, searching for the right words. I didn't know about you. If I had... It's okay, the boy interrupted, surprising him with his maturity. Mom explained that sometimes big, rich families are complicated. She said your sister didn't like her. The mention of his sister made Richard clench his fists involuntarily. If Victoria had really intercepted Emily's attempts to contact him, if his own sister had kept him from knowing his son all these years. I need to make some calls, he said abruptly, standing up. Would you come with me? To my house, I mean. There's plenty of space and we need to talk more, get to know each other better. Mrs. Wilson exchanged a worried glance with Ethan. Mr. Sullivan, this is very sudden. Ethan has school, friends, a routine here. I know. Richard ran a hand through his graying hair, trying to gather his thoughts. I'm not suggesting a permanent move right now, just a few days maybe? To spend time together. You can have separate rooms, complete privacy. I promise not to disrupt your lives more than necessary. Ethan looked at Mrs. Wilson expectantly. Behind his precocious maturity, there was still a child curious to meet the father he'd never had. I suppose we could stay a few days, Mrs. Wilson finally conceded. But first, I need to pack our things, and Ethan has a test at school tomorrow. Of course, Richard agreed quickly. I can send my driver to pick you up after school tomorrow, or I can come myself if you prefer. It was decided Richard would pick them up the next day after Ethan's test. As they said goodbye at the apartment door, the boy hesitated before asking, "Can I call you Dad?" The simple, direct question caught Richard completely off guard. His heart raced, and an indescribable emotion spread through his chest. "You can call me whatever feels most comfortable, Ethan," he finally replied. So we can take it slow, get to know each other first. The boy nodded, seeming satisfied with the answer. See you tomorrow, then. Richard, he said, testing the name. See you tomorrow, Ethan, Richard answered, resisting the urge to hug the boy he'd just met, but who had already turned his world upside down. As he drove back to his mansion on the Upper East Side, Richard felt as if he were in a dream. Or perhaps, for the first time in years, he was finally waking up. The first thing he did when he got home was call his sister. Victoria answered on the second ring, her voice annoyingly casual. Richard, what a surprise. I thought you'd be busy preparing for the charity dinner. Did you know about my son? He cut in bluntly. The silence on the other end was answer enough. Richard, what are you talking about? Victoria tried to sound confused, but there was a noticeable tremor in her voice. Don't lie to me, Victoria. Richard's voice was low, controlled, but laced with a rare anger. I just met Ethan, the son I had with Emily, the one you kept from me for 7 years. Another silence followed by a defeated sigh. You need to understand, Richard. That woman wasn't right for you. She would have ruined everything our family built. A scandal, a bastard child. Don't you dare call my son that, Richard cut in, the anger now evident in every syllable. Emily tried to tell me, didn't she? How many times did she come to me, and you stopped her? I did what was best for the family, Victoria replied, her voice regaining its usual coldness. For the business. You said it yourself, after you broke up, that it was the right decision. Because you and our parents convinced me of it, Richard exclaimed, slamming his fist on the marble desk in his office. You had no right, Victoria, no right to decide that for me. What are you going to do now? She asked, concern finally seeping through. You're not going to acknowledge him, are you? Think of the scandal, what the press will say, your fiancé. Don't tell me what to do, Richard interrupted. You've done enough. Ethan and the woman who's cared for him since Emily passed will be staying with me for a few days. I suggest you keep your distance during that time. I don't trust myself to see you right now. Without waiting for a response, Richard ended the call, tossing his phone onto the leather armchair. Sitting there in his lavish office, overlooking the immaculately kept gardens of his mansion, suddenly felt wrong. All of it, the house, the car, the priceless artwork, seemed hollow and meaningless when he thought of Ethan and Mrs. Wilson, living in that modest apartment in Greenwich Village. His thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Ashley, his fiancée. Slender, blonde, with the kind of beauty that seemed plucked from the pages of fashion magazines, she walked into the office without knocking, as was her habit. Richard, you won't believe what happened at the museum committee meeting today. That unbearable Samantha Richardson wanted to change the entire exhibition schedule, and she stopped when she noticed the look on his face. What's wrong? For a moment, Richard considered postponing the difficult conversation they needed to have. But then he remembered Ethan, eagerly waiting to get to know him better, and knew he couldn't keep hiding the truth. We need to talk, Ashley, he said, gesturing to the sofa. Something happened today that's going to change a lot in our lives. Ashley's expression instantly shifted to calculated concern. Are you sick? Is there a problem with the company? I found out I have a son, Richard said bluntly. A 7-year-old boy, my child with Emily. Ashley blinked a few times as if processing the information. Emily, your ex-girlfriend? The one who... Yes, Richard confirmed. She passed away a few months ago. The boy, Ethan, is being raised by a woman who was her friend. I met him today at the cemetery. And you're sure he's yours? Ashley questioned, her voice hardening. I'm sorry, Richard, but you need to be realistic. This could just be an attempt to... I'm sure, he interrupted. Emily had a DNA test done right after he was born. Besides, just look at the boy. He has the same eyes as my father. Ashley stood and walked to the window, keeping her back to Richard. What do you plan to do? Ethan and Mrs. Wilson will be staying here for a few days, Richard explained, so we can get to know each other better. After that, well, we'll need to figure out the next steps together. Turning slowly, Ashley faced him with an expression Richard couldn't decipher. You say we, but it seems you've already made your decision alone, she observed. I know how you think, Richard. You're already planning to bring them here. To live permanently, aren't you? Richard didn't answer immediately, realizing he had indeed begun considering that possibility. "Ashley, he's my son," he finally said. "A son I couldn't watch grow up for 7 years. I can't just ignore that." "And what about me? Where do I fit into this new family arrangement you're planning?" she asked, crossing her arms. I suppose to become a stepmother to a boy I don't even know." The coldness in Ashley's tone made Richard realize something that had perhaps always been there, but he'd never wanted to see. Their relationship, which began 2 years after his breakup with Emily, had always been more convenient than passionate. Ashley was beautiful, intelligent, from a traditional New York City family, the kind of woman his parents approved of, the one Victoria adored, the perfect fit for the role of a successful businessman's wife. "I don't expect you to accept this right away," Richard said, standing and moving closer to her. "It's a complicated situation for all of us, but I'd like you to meet Ethan before making any decisions. He's an incredible boy, mature beyond his years." Ashley subtly pulled away when he tried to touch her arm. "I need time to think," she declared. "I'll go to the beach apartment for a few days. When your son and that woman are settled, let me know. Then I'll decide whether I want to meet them or not." Without waiting for a response, Ashley walked out of the office, her heels echoing down the marble hallway. Richard wasn't surprised by her reaction. In a way, he'd expected it. Ashley had always made it clear she had little interest in children, especially other people's. Her life plan included at most one child, preferably after 35, once her career as an art curator was well established. Alone again, Richard turned his attention to the next challenge, preparing the house for Ethan and Mrs. Wilson. He needed to make sure they felt welcome, comfortable. For the first time in years, the enormous mansion with its 10 bedrooms no longer seemed like a waste of space. He called Martha, the housekeeper who had worked for him for over a decade, and explained the situation. "Mr. Sullivan," Martha said. After hearing everything, her eyes misty. "What wonderful news, a son! I'll prepare the best room for him right away. What does he like to eat? Any allergies? We'll need to buy clothes, toys." Martha's genuine excitement touched Richard. It was refreshing to see someone receive the news with joy, without questioning, without calculating consequences. "Truthfully, Martha, I don't know much about his preferences yet," Richard admitted, "but we'll figure it out together." That night, Richard barely slept. He lay awake, tossing and turning, thinking of everything he'd missed over the past 7 years. Ethan's first smile, his first steps, his first words, precious moments he could never get back. He also thought of Emily. How hard it must have been for her, pregnant and alone, rejected by his family. And yet, she'd never spoken ill of him to their son. Instead, she'd made sure Ethan grew up knowing he had a father, even if absent. The next morning, Richard woke up determined to do what was right. Not just out of duty or obligation, but because in just a few hours with Ethan, he'd already felt a connection he couldn't deny. The day passed slowly, as Richard tried, and failed to focus on work. At 2 p.m. he left the office early, something unheard of for him, and drove personally to Ethan's school in Greenwich Village. It was a modest public school, with colorful walls and children's drawings decorating the bulletin boards outside. He parked the Range Rover on the busy street, drawing curious glances, and waited by the gate. When the bell rang, dozens of children came running out, their cheerful voices filling the air. Among them, Richard spotted Ethan, chatting animatedly with a boy his age. When he saw him, his son gave a shy smile and waved. "Hi, Richard," he said, walking over. "You actually came." There was a note of surprise in the boy's voice, as if he were used to broken promises. "Of course I came," Richard replied, resisting the urge to hug him. "We had a deal, right? How was the test?" "I think I did okay," Ethan shrugged. "It was math, and I like numbers." "I always liked math too," Richard remarked, feeling a strange satisfaction at discovering yet another similarity between them. Mrs. Wilson was waiting for them on the corner, carrying 2 modest suitcases. She greeted Richard with a nod and a cautious smile. "We only brought the essentials," she explained, as Richard loaded the bags into the trunk. "Ethan has homework to do and his asthma medicine." "Asthma?" Richard looked at his son with concern. I didn't know. It's mild, Mrs. Wilson reassured him. We just need to be careful on very dry days or if he overexerts himself playing soccer. Another important detail about his son that Richard hadn't known. How many more things were there to learn? On the drive to the Upper East Side, Ethan gazed out the car window in fascination, occasionally pointing at a building or monument. That building looks like a pencil, he exclaimed as they passed the Italy building. It's one of the tallest in the city, Richard explained, seizing the chance to share his architectural knowledge. It was built in the 1960s. Have you ever built a building that tall? Ethan asked, his eyes shining with curiosity. A few even taller, Richard replied, feeling a mix of pride and humility under his son's admiring gaze. If you'd like, I can take you to see some of our projects. I'd love that, Ethan exclaimed excitedly. Mom used to show me pictures of your buildings in magazines. She kept all of them. This revelation warmed Richard's heart. Despite everything, Emily had kept his memory alive for their son. When they arrived at the mansion, Ethan couldn't hide his astonishment. His eyes widened as the electronic gate opened, revealing the stone pathway leading to the imposing neoclassical house. Do you live here all alone? The boy asked, stepping out of the car. With the staff, Richard answered. Martha, the housekeeper, Carl, the gardener, and Rose, the cook. Oh, and Rusty, my dog. You have a dog? Ethan's eyes lit up even more. What kind? A chocolate Labrador. He's old now, almost 12, but still playful. No sooner had he spoken than Rusty came running through the garden, drawn by the sound of the car. The usually reserved Labrador cautiously approached Ethan, sniffing him curiously. To Richard's surprise, the boy crouched down to the dog's level and held out his hand, letting Rusty sniff him before attempting to pet him. It was exactly what Emily used to do when she visited Richard and met Rusty, then just a puppy. He likes you, Richard observed as Rusty licked Ethan's hand. He's usually more wary of strangers. Mom taught me how to make friends with dogs, Ethan explained, stroking Rusty's ears. She said she had a Labrador when she was little. Yet another thing Richard hadn't known about Emily. How many more details of her life had he missed during the years they were together? Martha appeared at the door, her face lit up with a warm smile. Welcome, she exclaimed, coming down the steps to greet them. Snack is ready and the rooms are all set. While Martha led Mrs. Wilson to tour the house, Richard stayed behind with Ethan, who was still playing with Rusty. Do you like the house, Cuddy asked, a little nervous about the answer. Ethan looked around, considering the question seriously. It's really big, he finally replied. And pretty, but it doesn't seem very lived in. The observation, so simple and direct, struck Richard deeply. It was true, the mansion, with its vast spaces and impeccable decor, felt more like a showroom than a home. Maybe you can help me make it cozier, Richard suggested, surprising himself with his own words. Ethan smiled, clearly pleased with the idea. Can I put some of my drawings on the fridge? He asked. Mrs. Wilson always lets me. Of course you can, Richard replied, feeling a wave of affection at the thought of the imported stainless steel fridge covered in colorful drawings. This is your home now too. The words came out naturally, unplanned, but as he said them, Richard realized that's exactly how he felt. This child, whom he'd known for less than 24 hours, had already secured a permanent place in his heart. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, back to the story. The following days brought a remarkable transformation to the Sullivan Mansion. What was once an impeccably decorated but soulless space began to come alive with Ethan's presence. Colorful drawings adorned the fridge, held up by fruit-shaped magnets Martha had bought specifically for that purpose. Children's books occupied a corner of the living room, previously dominated only by valuable art pieces and architecture magazines. And the sound of laughter, something rare in that house, echoed through the halls when Ethan played with Rusty in the garden. Richard, used to long hours at the office, started coming home earlier. He found unexpected joy in helping Ethan with homework, listening to his stories about school, or simply watching him build elaborate castles with the blocks they'd bought together. Mrs. Wilson observed this growing bond with a mix of satisfaction and caution. One evening after Ethan had gone to bed, she shared her concerns with Richard. "The boy gets attached easily," she said, her hands busy with an embroidery she'd brought with her. "He has an open heart, just like his mother, but he also gets hurt deeply." Richard, sitting in the armchair across from her in the living room, nodded thoughtfully. "I'm taking this very seriously, Mrs. Wilson," he assured her. "This isn't a whim or a passing phase. Ethan is my son. I want to be part of his life for good." She looked up from her embroidery, studying Richard's face intently. "And what does that mean in practice, Mr. Sullivan?" she asked directly. "Ethan has an established life in Greenwich Village. Friends, school, a routine. Are you going to take him away from all that?" The question caught Richard off guard. It was true that in his initial plans he'd imagined Ethan and Mrs. Wilson living there, in the mansion, but he hadn't fully considered what that would mean for the boy, accustomed to a completely different reality. "I don't want to uproot his life," he admitted, "but I also want to give him opportunities he wouldn't have otherwise. A better school, extracurricular activities, travel. And don't you think you can offer all that without tearing him away from his roots?" Mrs. Wilson questioned, her voice gentle but firm. Emily always wanted Ethan to know his father, but she also wanted him to grow up grounded, understanding the value of simple things. Mrs. Wilson's words made Richard Sullivan reflect on his own privileged, yet emotionally barren childhood. He had grown up with every material luxury imaginable, but had rarely experienced the kind of human warmth he saw between Ethan and Mrs. Wilson. "What do you suggest, then?" he asked, genuinely interested in the opinion of this woman who knew his son better than he did. "A middle ground," she replied, picking up her embroidery again. "Ethan can spend some days here, others with us. He can attend a better school, yes, but still keep in touch with his friends from the neighborhood. He can learn about your world, Mr. Sullivan, without losing touch with his roots." Mrs. Wilson's simple wisdom left Richard feeling both humbled and grateful. She could have easily pushed for a permanent move to the mansion, securing a more comfortable life for herself, but her focus was entirely on Ethan's well-being. "You're right," he finally agreed. "We'll build this together step by step, always thinking of what's best for him." Mrs. Wilson smiled, satisfied. "That's how you build a family, Mr. Sullivan, not with concrete walls, but with daily compromises, small adjustments, and lots of love." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of the doorbell. Richard checked his watch, frowning. It was almost 10 at night, too late for visitors. Carl, the gardener who also acted as nighttime security, announced over the intercom, "Mr. Richard, your sister is here." Richard exchanged a concerned glance with Mrs. Wilson. Since learning about Ethan, he hadn't spoken to Victoria beyond that tense phone call. "Ask her to wait in the sitting room," he instructed, standing up. "I'll see her." Mrs. Wilson also rose, gathering her embroidery. "I'll check on Ethan to make sure he's sleeping well," she said quietly, excusing herself. Victoria stood waiting in the sitting room, impeccably dressed even at this hour, as if she'd come straight from a social event. Her critical gaze swept the room, lingering on Ethan's drawings pinned to the wall and the toys neatly arranged in a basket in the corner. "I see you've already redecorated the house," she remarked as Richard entered. "What do you want?" "Victoria?" he asked bluntly. She sighed, adjusting a perfectly dyed blonde strand of hair. "I came to see my nephew, of course, and to make sure you're not doing anything impulsive and reckless." "Like hiding my own son's existence from me for 7 years," Richard shot back, resentment clear in his voice. "That kind of reckless?" "Don't be dramatic," Victoria dismissed with a wave of her hand. "I did what I thought was best for everyone. That woman was an opportunist. You know that." "Emily never asked for anything for herself," Richard defended, keeping his voice low so as not to wake Ethan. "Not even when she was sick and needed expensive treatment. Proud till the end." A flicker of discomfort crossed Victoria's eyes, but she quickly regained her composure. "Regardless of the past, we're dealing with a present situation that needs to be handled carefully," she said, adopting the practical tone she used in business meetings. "Have you thought about the impact this will have on the company? On clients, on your reputation?" Richard laughed humorlessly. "My reputation? That's what you're worried about? Not the fact that your nephew grew up without a father? Because of you?" Our parents would never have approved, Victoria argued, her voice hardening. You know how they are. They would have disowned you on the spot if they knew you got a housemaid pregnant. Our parents haven't been in charge for years, Richard reminded her. And even if they were, it would have been my decision. My life, Victoria. You had no right. What about Ashley? Victoria shifted tactics. Does she know yet? Has she called off the engagement? Ashley is processing the news, Richard replied evasively. Truth be told, he hadn't heard from his fiancée since she left for the coast 3 days ago. But that's none of your business. Victoria stepped closer, softening her expression. Richard, you're my brother. I've always wanted what's best for you. That boy, he seems like a good kid, I'm not denying that. But bringing him into your life like this, so suddenly, will change everything. The plans we made for the company, the international expansion. Plans can change, Richard interrupted, and the company won't fall apart just because I spend more time with my son. The boy doesn't have to live here, Victoria insisted. You can provide financial support, visit him occasionally, keep him comfortable, but enough, Victoria. Richard's voice, though still quiet, carried an authority that silenced his sister. Ethan is my son. I'm going to be present in his life every single day. If that doesn't fit into your plans for the future of Sullivan Construction, I'm sorry. Before Victoria could respond, a small noise caught their attention. Ethan was standing in the doorway, his curly hair tousled from sleep, his eyes squinting in the light. I thought I heard voices, he said, rubbing his eyes. His curious gaze settled on Victoria. Hi. Victoria was momentarily speechless, studying the boy with a complex expression. It was impossible to deny the resemblance to Richard, the shape of his chin, the set of his eyes. Ethan, this is my sister, Victoria, Richard introduced, stepping closer to his son and placing a protective hand on his shoulder. Your aunt. Ethan studied Victoria for a moment before saying, Mom had a picture of you from Dad's graduation. You were wearing a green dress. The boy's precise memory of a photo from nearly a decade ago seemed to unsettle Victoria. For a brief moment, her composed mask slipped, revealing a rarely seen vulnerability. Ethan, it's late, Richard said gently. Why don't you go back to bed? I promise I'll bring you some hot chocolate in a few minutes. The boy nodded, but before leaving, he looked at Victoria again. How you have the same nose as Dad, he observed, but you don't seem to smile much. With that innocently cutting remark, Ethan left, leaving a heavy silence in the room. Victoria was the first to break it. He's observant, she commented, a slight tremor in her voice. Like his mother, Richard replied. Then, meeting his sister's gaze with determination, he added, I won't give him up, Victoria. No matter what you or anyone else says, I've already lost too much time. Victoria seemed about to argue, but something in Richard's expression stopped her. In the end, she only nodded. I see your mind's made up. I hope you know what you're doing. For the first time in a long time, I think I do, Richard answered, with a certainty that surprised even himself. After Victoria left, Richard prepared the promised hot chocolate and brought it to Ethan's room. He found his son sitting on the bed, flipping through a book of stories Martha had bought him. Your aunt doesn't like me, Ethan stated, as Richard entered, accepting the steaming mug. That's not it, Richard replied, sitting on the edge of the bed. Victoria, she takes time to adjust to change. And you, my son, are a big change in her life. In my life. In the best possible way. Ethan took a sip of the chocolate before asking, was it her who kept you from knowing about me? The direct question caught Richard off guard. How do you explain something so complicated to a child? It's not simple, Ethan, he said finally. Sometimes grown-ups make decisions they think are right but end up hurting others. Your aunt thought she was protecting me, but really, she was keeping us apart. You, me, and your mom. Mom never got angry, Ethan remarked thoughtfully. She said that one day you would know about me when the time was right. Emily's unshakable faith, even in the face of apparent abandonment, moved Richard deeply. Your mother was a very special person, he said, his voice choked. And you're a lot like her, not just in looks, but in here too. He lightly touched his son's chest, indicating the heart. Ethan smiled, finishing his hot chocolate. "Can I ask you something?" he said, placing the empty mug on the nightstand. "Of course," Richard replied. "Anything." "Did you and Mom love each other?" The question, so simple and direct, hit Richard like a physical blow. For a moment he considered giving a softened answer, something an adult would tell a child to simplify a complicated relationship. But looking into Ethan's expectant eyes, he knew he owed his son the truth. "Yes, Ethan, we loved each other," he admitted, feeling an old pain resurface. "Very much. But sometimes love isn't enough when people come from different worlds and have families who don't understand that love." "Like Romeo and Juliet?" Ethan asked. "We studied it in school." Richard smiled, surprised by the parallel. "Something like that, but without the tragic ending," he replied. "Your mother and I went our separate ways, but we created something wonderful together." Ethan seemed satisfied with the answer. He leaned back against the pillows, his eyes growing heavy with sleep again. "Good night, Dad," he murmured before closing his eyes. It was the first time Ethan had called him that without hesitation. Richard felt an overwhelming emotion rush through him. "Good night, son," he replied softly, leaning down to kiss the boy's forehead. That night, Richard slept better than he had in years, certain that despite the mistakes and lost time, he was finally on the right path. The following days brought new challenges and discoveries. Richard hired a family law attorney to formalize Ethan's legal status, ensuring all documents officially recognized his paternity. He also began conversations with private schools near Greenwich Village, seeking a balance between providing his son with a better education and maintaining his roots, as Mrs. Wilson had suggested. The transition wasn't without obstacles. Ashley finally returned from the coast, but only to confirm what Richard already suspected. She wasn't willing to share her life with a child who wasn't hers. The engagement was quietly called off, with a mutual agreement to avoid scandal. Victoria, meanwhile, kept a cautious distance, though Richard noticed small changes in her attitude. Once she showed up with an expensive building set for Ethan, casually claiming she just happened to pass by the store. The boy thanked her politely, but preferred to keep playing with the simple blocks he already had, a subtle reminder that expensive gifts wouldn't easily buy his affection. One Sunday afternoon, while Ethan played in the garden with Rusty under Mrs. Wilson's watchful eye, Richard received an unexpected visit. Peter, his personal assistant, arrived unannounced, carrying a cardboard box. "Sorry to bother you on the weekend, Mr. Sullivan," he said, visibly nervous, "but I found something in the company's old archives that I thought you should see." Curious, Richard invited Peter into his office, away from Ethan's ears. "What did you find?" he asked, gesturing for his assistant to sit. Peter placed the box on the desk. "I was reorganizing the old files, as you requested, and I came across this box labeled Mrs. Emily Parker. Apparently these were letters received between 2015 and 2017 that never reached you." Richard's heart raced. That period coincided with Emily's pregnancy and Ethan's early years. "How is this possible?" he asked, opening the box, with slightly trembling hands. "All mail addressed to me passes through your desk." "Not back then, sir," Peter reminded him. "I was still working in the finance department. The one handling your personal correspondence was my sister," Richard completed, understanding dawning. Inside the box were over a dozen letters, all with Emily's name as the sender. Some had been opened and then carefully resealed, others remained untouched. There were also a few small boxes and a flash drive. With a heavy heart, Richard began reading the letters, organizing them by date. The first one, sent just 3 weeks after their breakup, announced the pregnancy. The following ones documented Emily's persistent efforts to reach him, her doctor's appointments, the baby's first movements. One of the boxes contained Ethan's first ultrasound. Another held a small lock of hair with a note. "From our son's first haircut." The flash drive, when plugged into the computer, revealed dozens of photos and short videos. Ethan as a newborn, Ethan taking his first steps, Ethan blowing out his first birthday candle. Richard watched it all with a mix of fascination and deep pain. Those precious moments, stolen from him for years, now returned as fragments of an alternate life he could have lived. "Thank you, Peter," he finally said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "This is priceless." The assistant nodded, clearly uncomfortable with the intensity of the moment. "I thought you should know. The confidentiality I owe the company doesn't extend to this," he said, gesturing to the opened letters. "It didn't seem ethical to me." After Peter left, Richard remained in his office for hours, absorbing every word, every image. One letter in particular, written when Ethan was about 3, struck him deeply. "Dear Richard, today Ethan asked about you for the first time. Where's my dad?" he wanted to know with that straightforward curiosity children have. "I told him you're building giant buildings, helping people have beautiful homes to live in. Will he build a house for us too?" was his next question. I didn't know what to say. "I'm not writing this to make you feel guilty. I know if you'd received my earlier letters, you'd be here. I know your heart, Richard, even if you try to hide it under those expensive suits and that serious businessman demeanor. I write because I promised Ethan I'd keep trying, that one day when he was ready and you were too, you'd meet. He has your eyes, you know, and that furrow between his brows when he's concentrating, just like you. With eternal love. Emily." When he finally left the office, it was already night. He found Mrs. Wilson in the kitchen making tea. Ethan had already been put to bed. "I found out something today," Richard said, sinking heavily into a chair at the table. Mrs. Wilson studied his weary face and simply placed a cup of hot tea in front of him, waiting for him to continue. "My assistant found letters and photos Emily sent over the years, letters my sister intercepted and hid." The older woman nodded, not seeming particularly surprised. "Emily suspected as much," she said softly. "In recent years, she kept writing more for therapy than from real hope of a response." "I've lost so much time," Richard murmured, running his hands over his tired face. "Moments that will never come back." "That's true," Mrs. Wilson agreed, her frankness surprising him. "You can't get the past back. But the future is still open, Mr. Sullivan, and Ethan has many years ahead that will need a present father." The simple wisdom of that woman once again gave Richard a perspective that his money and privileged education could never buy. "Thank you, Mrs. Wilson," he said sincerely, "for taking such good care of my son when I couldn't, and for helping me be a better father now." The woman smiled, a warm smile that lit up her time-worn face. "Emily always said you were a good man, Mr. Sullivan. You just needed to find your way back to your heart." That night before bed, Richard quietly entered Ethan's room. The boy slept peacefully, one arm wrapped around the worn-out teddy bear he'd brought with him from the apartment in Greenwich Village. As Richard looked at the child who was part of him, part of Emily, he made a silent promise, not just to Ethan, but to Emily too, wherever she might be. He vowed to make up for every lost moment with twice the love and presence, that he would protect that boy and his memories of his mother with all his strength, and above all, that he would never again let pride, money, or status come between him and the people he loved. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. Weeks turned into months, and a new rhythm settled into Richard and Ethan's lives. As Mrs. Wilson had suggested, they found a middle ground that seemed to work well for everyone. Ethan continued at the same school, but now had private tutors to supplement his education after class. He spent 4 nights a week at the mansion, with Richard, and 3 at the apartment in Greenwich Village with Mrs. Wilson, maintaining his ties to the community where he'd grown up. Richard completely restructured his professional schedule. For the first time in his career, he delegated major projects, declined long trips, and set a firm rule not to work past 6 in the evening or on weekends. His partners and executives at Sullivan Construction initially met these changes with skepticism, but they soon realized that a more balanced, happier Richard was also more efficient and creative during the hours he did dedicate to work. Victoria, surprisingly, began gradually warming up to Ethan. It all started when the boy, visiting Richard's office, noticed an error in a cost spreadsheet Victoria was reviewing. a small talent for numbers that seemed inherited from both his father and his mother's side, since Emily had been a brilliant accounting student before dropping out due to financial struggles. "The boy has potential," Victoria admitted reluctantly after Ethan spotted the mistake that two professional accountants had missed. "With the right education, he could become a competent executive." "He's only 7, Victoria," Richard replied, amused. "Let's let him be a child first." But the ice was broken. Victoria began occasionally joining Sunday lunches at the mansion, always bringing Ethan an educational book or strategy game. The boy, with his natural ability to see beyond appearances, seemed to understand his aunt's effort to connect and accepted her gifts with genuine gratitude. During one of these visits, after Ethan had gone outside to play with Rusty in the garden, Victoria finally addressed the unspoken tension between them. "I was wrong," she said simply, staring at her coffee cup. "About Emily, about the boy." Richard, who had learned the value of silence from Mrs. Wilson, simply waited for her to continue. "I read some of her letters," Victoria admitted, her usually composed face revealing rare vulnerability. "Not recently, but back then. She really loved you. It wasn't what I thought." "Why, Victoria?" asked Richard, the old hurt still present in his voice. "Why didn't you let me decide for myself?" Victoria sighed deeply. "Fear, I suppose. Fear of losing the company to someone outside the family. Fear that you'd drift away, that you'd start your own family and leave me behind." She laughed humorlessly. "Ironic, isn't it? I ended up causing exactly what I feared." The resentment Richard had harbored for months began to dissolve in the face of his sister's honesty. Not completely, some wounds were too deep to heal quickly, but enough to glimpse a path toward reconciliation. "We're still family, Victoria," he said at last. "You, me, and now Ethan, but I need to know I can trust you, that you'll never interfere in my life or my son's life like that again." "I promise," she replied, lifting her eyes. "To meet his, and I want to be part of his life if you'll let me. Be the aunt he deserves." For a moment, Richard saw in her the girl he'd known in childhood, before their parents' expectations and the pressures of business had turned her into the calculating woman she'd become. Maybe Ethan, with his disarming sincerity, could help bring that Victoria back. "He'd like that," Richard said, offering a cautious smile, "and so would I." Richard's professional life also underwent changes. Inspired by Emily's story, how she had abandoned her studies due to financial hardship, he established a foundation in her name dedicated to providing scholarships for talented youth from underprivileged communities. The first headquarters was set up in Greenwich Village, in a historic building restored by Sullivan Construction. On the day of the Emily Parker Foundation's inauguration, Ethan cut the ribbon beside his father, wearing a little suit he'd picked out himself for the occasion. His beaming face, captured by photographers from various newspapers and magazines, became the symbol of a new chapter in the Sullivan family's history. Media coverage of Richard Sullivan's secret heir was initially sensational, as expected. But Richard's transparent approach, publicly acknowledging paternity and openly sharing how he'd been kept from his son, turned what could have been a scandal into a touching story of family reunion. In an interview with the country's leading financial newspaper, Richard stunned the market by declaring his priorities had completely shifted. "For years, I believed my legacy would be measured in square feet, built or numbers on financial statements," he said. "Now I know my true legacy is my son and the values I can pass on to him." This new perspective also reflected in the construction company's projects, which began investing in quality social housing and revitalizing neglected historic areas like Greenwich Village itself. What initially seemed a risky business decision turned into a competitive advantage, attracting investors concerned with social responsibility and sustainability. Amid all these changes, Ethan flourished. The shy boy Richard had met at the cemetery grew into a confident, well-adjusted child, equally at ease in his father's luxurious world and Mrs. Wilson's simple, warm home. His school grades were excellent, and his teachers praised not just his intelligence, but his generosity toward struggling classmates. A year after their meeting at the cemetery, Richard and Ethan returned for a special visit. Carrying a bouquet of daisies, Emily's favorite flowers, they approached the now simpler but no less beautiful memorial. Richard had replaced the ostentatious structure with something he believed Emily would prefer: a small, well-tended garden around a simple plaque with her name and a phrase she often repeated, "True love always finds its way." Ethan carefully placed the flowers near the plaque and then pulled the colorful bracelet from his pocket, identical to the one Emily wore in the photo. "I don't think I need this anymore to remember Mom," he said, looking at Richard. "Can I leave it here with her?" Richard nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He watched as his son gently placed the bracelet beside the flowers. "You know what she used to tell me when I was sad because I didn't have a dad like the other kids?" Ethan asked, still gazing at the memorial. "She said, 'Your father will find you when the time is right. Until then, he's kept safe in your heart.'" Richard knelt to his son's level, placing his hands on his shoulders. "Your mother was very wise," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And she was right. I found you, even if it took longer than it should have." Ethan turned to face his father, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I think she planned it all," he said with a small conspiratorial smile. "She knew I'd come here that day and see you crying." The idea that Emily, even after passing, had found a way to bring them together didn't seem so absurd to Richard. There was something almost mystical in how it had all unfolded. "Maybe you're right," he replied, hugging his son. "Your mother always had a special way of making things happen." They stayed like that for a few moments, father and son united by the love of the woman whose physical absence had become a constant presence in their lives. When they finally pulled away, Ethan wore a serene, almost grown-up expression. "Can we visit the orphanage on the way home?" he asked. "I promised Aunt Victoria I'd help with the books she donated." Richard smiled, proud of the son who had inherited not just his features, but Emily's kindness and generosity. "Of course we can," he answered, taking the boy's small but firm hand. "We have all the time in the world." As they walked through the cemetery toward the car, Richard reflected on how his life had completely changed in just 1 year. The man, who once measured success by the size of his bank account, now recognized true wealth in the little things, in Ethan's laughter over breakfast, in the stories shared before bedtime, in the pride he felt watching his son grow into a kind and compassionate person. The unexpected meeting at the cemetery had not only given him a son, but had also restored a part of himself he'd lost long ago, the ability to feel, to care, to put relationships above material achievements. And as he watched Ethan run ahead, to open the car door, Richard felt a deep certainty that wherever Emily was, she was smiling. The end of the story. And you? What did you think of this emotional reunion between father and son? Share in the comments if you've ever experienced a family reconciliation that changed your life. Leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next stories of love and triumph.